In the small village of Amigu, Mrs. A lived a simple life with her only daughter, Emma. Emma, a 12-year-old girl, was known throughout the village for her beauty, which matched the meaning of her name, beauty itself. Her delicate features, bright eyes, and graceful demeanor made her stand out, but despite their humble life, she never showed off. She was kind, respectful, and always by her mother's side. The villagers often saw the mother and daughter duo working on different farmlands. They didn't own any land of their own, but they were always willing to help others. In return, they received enough food and a small amount of money to survive. It wasn't much, but it was enough for them to get by. Despite their poverty, they were content, and their bond made their life feel richer than it seemed. Emma admired her mother more than anyone else in the world. Mrs. A was a hardworking woman, and even though they didn't have much, she always found a way to take care of her daughter. Every day after their work in the fields, they would return to their small hut and share a simple meal. Sometimes it was just yam and palm oil, but Emma never complained. She was grateful for every meal because she knew how hard her mother worked. Even at such a young age, Emma had taken on a lot of responsibility. She helped her mother with every task, whether it was working in the fields, fetching water, or preparing their meals. She didn't have the luxury of playing with the other children, but she didn't mind. Her mother's health and happiness were more important to her than anything else. One evening, after a long day of work, Mrs. A complained of feeling unusually tired. At first, Emma thought it was just the exhaustion from working in the sun all day. But as the days passed, her mother's condition worsened. She began to cough frequently, and her once strong body seemed to grow weaker by the day. Emma grew increasingly worried. She had never seen her mother so sick before. Mrs. A, who had always been a pillar of strength, now struggled to even stand. Emma tried her best to take care of her, preparing herbal teas and fetching water from the nearby stream, but nothing seemed to work. Her mother's health continued to deteriorate, and Emma felt helpless. Desperate to find a cure, Emma began visiting the village's medicine women. She asked them for advice and bought various herbs with the little money they had saved. Every day, she would go into the bush to gather leaves and roots, hoping to find something that would make her mother better. When she wasn't in the bush, she was in the market asking traders for herbal medicines. Despite her best efforts, nothing seemed to help. Emma tried everything she could find, but Mrs. A's condition only grew worse. Emma was filled with fear. She couldn't imagine a life without her mother, and the thought of losing her sent waves of panic through her heart. But she didn't give up. She knew she had to keep trying, no matter how hopeless it seemed. One afternoon, after another failed attempt to improve her mother's health, Emma walked home from the forest, tears streaming down her face. As she hurried through the village, a woman she didn't know stopped her. The woman, noticing Emma's distress, asked why she was crying. At first, Emma hesitated to answer, but the woman's kind eyes gave her a sense of comfort. Emma explained her mother's illness and how she had tried everything to help her, but nothing worked. The woman listened carefully and then told Emma about a powerful chief priest who lived in a neighboring village called Oko. According to the woman, the priest had healed many people who were near death, and he might be able to help Mrs. A too. Emma's heart filled with hope at the stranger's words. This was the first time she had heard of the priest, but she knew she had to try. If there was even the smallest chance that he could save her mother, she had to take it. Without wasting any time, she thanked the woman and ran home to tell her mother about the priest. Mrs. A was too weak to speak, but Emma could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. She knew her mother was scared of what might happen, and so was she. But Emma pushed those feelings aside. She couldn't afford to be scared now. She had to be strong for her mother. After gathering a few things, she helped Mrs. A into a small cart borrowed from a neighbor, and they began the long journey to Oko. The journey to Oko was exhausting. Emma had to pull the cart herself, and the road was rough and uneven, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not when her mother's life was at stake. When they finally arrived in Oko, it was already evening, and the village was quiet. Emma asked around until someone pointed her to the chief priest's shrine. The shrine was large and intimidating, with strange carvings and symbols on the walls. Emma felt a shiver of fear run down her spine as she approached the priest. He was an old man with a stern face, but there was something powerful about him. When Emma explained her mother's condition, the priest listened silently, then told her that he could heal Mrs. A, but it would come at a cost. Alongside her, apologizing and explaining that she had only wanted to save her mother's life, no matter the cost, Mrs. A was unable to find peace that night, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her heart. She sobbed quietly until, exhausted from grief, she eventually fell into a restless sleep, her mind troubled by the difficult reality her daughter had faced alone. In the morning, after Emma had completed her morning chores, she decided to visit the market to buy some food. Before leaving, she checked on her mother, who was still sleeping peacefully. Emma didn't want to wake her, so she quietly left the hut and promised herself she would be back soon. 3 hours later, Emma returned with food, eager to check on her mother. When she entered the hut, Mrs. A was still in bed exactly as Emma had left her, but something was wrong. Emma called out to her mother, but there was no response. Her heart raced as she rushed to the bed and touched her mother's hand. It was cold. Panic set in as Emma shook her mother, calling her name over and over, but it was too late. Mrs. A was gone. Emma's world shattered in that moment. The woman who had been her entire world, the one person she had fought so hard to save, was gone. Emma collapsed next to the bed, her cries echoing through the shrine. That same night, Mrs. A was buried in the shrine's forest. According to the village's customs, anyone who died at the shrine had to be buried in the shrine's forest far away from their home. Emma was devastated. She couldn't believe that her mother was gone. She hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye. The burial was a small and solemn affair, attended only by the chief priest, his servants, and Emma. As they laid Mrs. A to rest, Emma's heart felt like it was being torn apart. The forest, dark and silent, seemed to swallow her mother whole. Emma stood there, numb with grief. After the burial, Emma returned to the hut she shared with her mother, but now it felt cold and empty. The one person who had always been there for her was gone, and she had no one left to turn to. She curled up in the corner of the hut, crying until there were no more tears left to shed. Her mother's death felt like the end of her world. 3 days after the burial, Emma went to the chief priest to ask for permission to return to her village. She wanted to leave the shrine and go back to the life she knew, even if it meant being alone. But the chief priest refused. He reminded Emma of the agreement she had made before her mother's treatment, that she would serve him for 5 years. Emma was shocked. She had hoped that the priest would show some compassion after her mother's death, but he was firm in his decision. The agreement had been made, and there was no going back. Emma had no choice but to stay. She had no money, no family, and nowhere else to go. The priest's word was law in this part of the land. There was no one to fight for her. Emma's life at the shrine became one of routine and servitude. Every morning, she woke up before dawn to sweep the compound, fetch water, and prepare food for the priest and the 3 boys who served him. The boys were older than Emma. They had been with the priest for years, serving him without question. They didn't speak much to Emma, and she felt isolated and alone in their presence. The priest treated Emma well enough, giving her food and shelter, but there was always an unspoken tension in the air. Emma was trapped in this life, bound by the agreement she had made in desperation to save her mother. The days were long and hard. Emma found herself thinking about her mother constantly. The grief weighed heavily on her. She often went to the forest where her mother was buried to cry and talk to her in silence. One night, as Emma lay in her small hut, she woke up to the sound of footsteps. Her heart raced as the door opened, and the chief priest walked in. Emma felt scared, but didn't know what to do. He came closer, and she felt a sense of fear as he crossed boundaries that made her uncomfortable. Emma didn't know who to turn to or how to speak up. The priest was powerful, and she was just a servant. Emma felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The shame and guilt consumed her. She blamed herself for everything. She felt dirty, unworthy of kindness or love. She was just a servant, a tool for the priest to use whenever he wanted. Emma couldn't tell anyone about what was happening to her. Who would believe her? The priest was a powerful man. She was just a poor orphan girl. The boys who served the priest were always around, but they never spoke to her or asked her how she was. They seemed to live in their own world, disconnected from the pain and suffering Emma was going through. Each day, Emma went through the motions of her chores, trying to push the memories of the night away. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the priest's grasp. She felt trapped both physically and emotionally, and the weight of her silence grew heavier with each passing day. As months passed, Emma's once lean body began to change. Her belly started to swell, and her strength weakened. It wasn't long before she realized that she was pregnant with the priest's child. The thought made her sick to her stomach. How could this have happened to her? She was just a child herself. Now she was carrying the child of a man who had taken advantage of her.